Thank you to Strategic Law Partners for sponsoring this podcast. Strategic Law Partners was formed to provide the highest quality, common sense legal services at reasonable rates. Over its 25-year history in Los Angeles, Strategic Law Partners has represented many of the top local venture-backed companies, leading early-stage and late-stage investors, PE firms, and more. SLP Ventures has invested in over 75 companies, mostly in the Los Angeles area. Thank you to Brad and team. Hello, and welcome to the LA Venture Podcast. This is Minnie Ingersoll, host of the podcast and partner at TenOneTen. TenOneTen is a seed stage fund here in LA. All opinions expressed on this show by me and my guests are solely our own. I am excited to be catching up with Petra Griffith today. She built and launched Wedbush Ventures earlier this year after a stellar career in a variety of operating roles at Yahoo, Netflix, Grand Point Bank. Petra and Wedbush have really burst onto the scene in LA, and we have been looking at a lot of great companies together lately. Petra, I feel like I'm getting to know your tastes. Would you say seed, sometimes pre-seed, and how LA focused are you?
Yeah, great question. Pre-seed, seed, and I like LA. I have a preference for LA, but if I look at the companies that I've invested in so far, about half have been in LA and half are not in LA.
Yeah, this is why we're so compatible. We're exactly the same. Seed, pre-seed, half in LA. Okay, so start me with a little bit of your background. Maybe take us back. You're a product manager at Yahoo. Yahoo's changing CEOs faster than we can remember.
Yeah.
What were you up to?
I joined Yahoo in 2006, kind of in the heyday of Yahoo. Actually joined on the team that came out of Idea Lab, the Overture team that was acquired by Yahoo. I joined after the Yahoo acquisition. Spent 6 years at Yahoo, really learned and really got deeply embedded in ad tech and spent a lot of time and really got passionate about how do you make advertising a good experience for a consumer and for an advertiser. Search marketing is great because it's a great user experience and a great advertiser experience. Display advertising less so. And so we did a lot of work on how do you make display advertising a better consumer experience. Native ads, social ads, like its ability to share an ad, does that make it any more worthwhile? And it really doesn't. Last year at Yahoo in 2012, went through 5 CEOs. I was on they called it a Skunk Works project. We didn't fit into any of the silos at Yahoo. And every CEO, so we were directly funded by the CEO's office. Every CEO that came in was like, stop, what are you doing? Why are we spending money on this? And we had our little pitch deck and we'd go out and we present to them and say, oh, this is great, keep on going, keep on going. And so it literally took us 10 months to ship an alpha, and it was painful. And, Marissa Mayer came in. At that point, I was just emotionally done. But I was really, I'd been in LA actually since 2003, wanted to stay in LA, and having spent so much time up in the Bay Area and seeing just how you have these alumni that leave tech companies and then start the next one and invest in their friends, you were starting to see that happen here in LA. And that got me really excited. And I joined Grand Point Bank to set up their venture banking division.
Okay, great. So you joined Grand Point Ventures, doing venture bank.
Yeah.
Grand Point Bank, right. No, that's important. And doing venture banking, but I don't even really know what that is. So maybe you could give me the sort of 101.
And I didn't know what that was either when I started. Grand Point Bank was a bank, it was private equity backed. The founders had started, I think, 2 previous banks before then, sold those. And so they're banking entrepreneurs, and they'd raised money in the 2008 downturn to buy up banks that were good banks, but put them together and get efficiencies of scale. They had banked LegalZoom in their previous company, and LegalZoom they were angel investors in LegalZoom, and LegalZoom had become the largest deposit holder in their previous bank. And they're like, oh, these startups are great. Tech, startups, help us bank more startups. And I kind of went into that and realized quickly that what startups want is not checking accounts, but they want capital. And so set up a venture debt product at Grand Point Bank. And Grand Point Bank, just to be clear, was very much a community bank, a regional bank. They were about $5 billion in assets when I left. Did your traditional banking as a community bank. So what I was doing was a kind of a square peg in a round hole, so to speak.
So maybe you could tell me more about, what startups need to know about venture debt.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think first of all, venture debt is a very different animal, and I learned that when I was at Grand Point Bank. Traditional underwriting really looks at the cash flow. Does the business throw up enough cash to repay the loan? And then also you're always looking for two sources of repayment, and so there's a lot of personal guarantees involved. You're looking at the global cash flow. Venture debt is a just fundamentally different kind of animal. The venture debt that I did, there's a couple of different flavors of it. Is your term loan, and so we typically would help startups with their Series A. So if you raised, a $5 million Series A, venture debt would put on another $2 to $3 million on top of your Series A. And when it works really well, it is not as dilutive. There's some dilution with the warrant coverage, but it's non-dilutive capital for the company. It's not convertible note. It's not a convertible debt where your interest rate then, just becomes something that you repay and it converts into equity. It doesn't convert. That's what most founders are surprised about. A lot of times there are like 6 to 12 month delays, and when interest has to be paid back. And then when that happens, they're like, oh, we weren't expecting this. And it's like right when, your cash flow is tight and you didn't hit your metrics. I really think about who your partners, and that's one thing I really learned, is that traditional banks have a really hard time with venture debt because it is such a different way of thinking. You're not looking at cash flow. You're not looking at the regular metrics. Instead, you're looking at who's backing this company and will this company be able to raise money in the future. And so I would recommend for founders to really look at who is giving you this loan, and have they been doing this for a while? What covenants do you have?
Yeah, can you tell me a little bit more, educate me a little bit more on covenants and warrants?
Yeah, so covenants will be, basically covenants are there so that the underwriter has a check-in, or forces a check-in, because as an underwriter, you want to make sure that you're going to get repaid. And so covenants are basically triggers, and sometimes they trigger a default, and sometimes they just kind of trigger kind of a conversation. And once you're in default, like that's the language you should also really look at, because if you're in default, sometimes they can call the entire loan. Sometimes you can be in default just if you're a couple of days late on your payment. Sometimes you can be in default just because you didn't hit your projection by $1,000. It really depends on what those covenants are. And again, there's like financial covenants, and there are covenants like key person covenants, like the CEO can't leave. And so just really look at those covenants, make sure you can meet those. And then the warrants are it's your warrant coverage, and they're usually tied to some sort of exit event. The thing that I don't think a lot of people realize is that it's not the warrant coverage that makes the economics for a bank necessarily, but it's the deposits. And so these companies bring large deposits, and that's why it's so attractive for banks, because you're getting, you just flush with cash. You just got a $5 million raise, and that's now sitting in a bank account. And so venture banks, or banks that do venture lending, will often require you to move your bank account over to that bank. So also like check into that, like, do they have the right system? Can they do the wires the way you want to? Like, that's another pain point.
I feel like a lot of the VCs I know aren't really keen on having their startups raise a lot of venture debt or raise it early, but we see a lot more companies as they raise their Series A get those offers of debt. What do you recommend?
Yeah, I think at Series A, it makes a ton of sense. If the company has hit product market fit and it's really just growth capital, I've seen it be very successful, because you can kind of increase your overall raise by 50%, which gives you more cash to get to the next level and show more growth.
Cool. So you did that for a long time, but you moved on from there. So
I did.
So what next?
Yeah, after Grand Point Bank, banking is a very regulated industry, and I actually think about that a lot as an investor. It takes what it takes to innovate in that kind of environment. I really missed the unregulated world of media, and had an opportunity to join Netflix. They were hiring their first product team here in LA, focusing on originals and really thinking through what is the product implications of original content. And the culture of Netflix also really intrigued me. So I made that jump.
So both of those are interesting about the product side and the culture side, but kind of on the product side, what did you learn about making originals and distributing that content and how the product evolves?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing, there's a couple of things. I think one is original content is marketed often differently. So obviously, like the big shows across all of the streaming players are marketed offline, but a lot of shows are, like, especially shows that are generated outside of the US, they're on Netflix, but you haven't seen them out in the real world. And so how do you communicate that this is something worth watching if you've never seen any of the actors, you've never, like, the title doesn't mean anything to you? So the communication of that is really interesting, and you really learn that a lot of our decision as a consumer of whether or not to watch something is, one, trust in the platform, but two, also like what is the emotional state that I want to be in for the next hour or two, and just winning that trust over and over again. So it's like both the, like, how do you convey different elements of what the show or movie is about quickly to somebody, but also how do you gain their trust in the long term so that they're willing to try something out new. So spend a lot of time on that, and spend a lot of time on international content as well, and just how do you introduce people to content that is not in their language.
Really interesting. Well, I'm going to ask you more about content as an investor with your investor hat on, but just the culture, and what did you find in terms of moving from a bank to, content production? How was that culture change?
Yeah, I mean, I think Netflix is a jump from anywhere, but kind of going from Yahoo to the bank, and then from the bank to Netflix was definitely I remember the first week just being like, whoa, drinking from the fire hose. I should say, like, one thing that's amazing about Netflix is just, they treat you as an adult, and they expect you to perform, but they also give you the freedom to perform, and it's super liberating, and that's the very positive thing about Netflix. I think the thing that is hard for a lot of people is just the constant feedback culture, and feedback is not always, oftentimes the feedback isn't positive, and you get feedback from everywhere. And so how do you, especially as a sensitive person or someone who, like, really internalizes feedback, like, how do you work through that, and how do you figure out what feedback you want to take and which feedback you want to ignore, and how do you work on that?
One of the people who I really love, Frances Fry, she was a Harvard Business School professor, worked at Uber, and talked about the culture. And she said feedback should be like 5-1, positive to negative.
Interesting.
She's like, when you train a child or a dog, it's positive feedback. How do you, what lessons do you take from that when you're working with startups now about how they can build their feedback culture in the right way?
I think transparency is really important. So the bank, you have to be, you're dealing with other people's money. And so you have to be very strict about what's allowed, what's not allowed, how you train someone. And so it's just a little bit about being in a regulated industry. I grew up in Germany, and it's a vast overgeneralization. But if you talk to a customer service person in Germany, like, they're problem solvers, and they're like, try to understand what your problem is, and then they figure it out. And in the US, as a general rule, here's my script, and I will now read to you what I'm allowed to say. And so I always try to think about, how do you create a culture that's transparent, that's about problem solving, that is not afraid to raise issues and not afraid to probe. And that's the one thing I have to say that I really admired about Netflix is, like, you're constantly probing, you're constantly debating, you're pushing each other, you're questioning the status quo. And then if you come up with information that proves otherwise, like, the whole organization will really truly move around that. And that's the thing that I always try to talk to founders about, is like, how do you know that? Like, can you prove that? Can you be open to are you open to other data points that might prove or might show that you're not on the right path?
And what about, just one more question on that, what about sort of going from a bank to a very creative environment where you're working on originals and there's, actors and producers and directors all involved? Was that a big difference?
Just slightly.
Yeah. Okay. So you decided to be a VC.
Don't they say VCs always take unlinear paths?
Yes. I think if you ask 20 VCs how they became a VC, you get 20 different answers. Okay. So, but I do think that's really interesting. How did you decide, okay, I'm at Netflix now? How did you go about forming this fund? Because you started it on your own, right? I mean, you are the only partner at Wedbush.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, I think also to explain a little bit more, like one thing I really enjoyed when I was in banking is that I came to banking with a tech background, and so I was able to really translate banking to the tech world. And when I looked at what Netflix is going through, and here you are, like you're this tech company who's trying to innovate in entertainment, which is a older industry, more established industry. And so what really intrigued me there is like, being able to translate and build that bridge between two very different stakeholders, attitudes, cultures, and being able to learn both.
I hadn't thought about this. So I always think, I think of Hollywood as sort of some dynamic, mysterious place that I never visit, but full of creative people. I don't really think of it as sort of an older, established, almost more old school industry. But I guess, traditionally it really has been.
Yeah, and there's a certain way of doing things in Hollywood. Like just for example, like marketing, it's all about, or not even marketing, but like all movies are made like by demographics, and what demographic are you going to target, and here's how you're going to finance it, and so Netflix coming in with this different model, and also the whole production process of like, we're going to shoot a pilot first, and then if that pilot, we're going to shop this pilot around, and the pilot gets acquired, and that doesn't actually even mean that you're going to make a show out of it. And Netflix just looked at it and said, no, we're just going to buy the whole show and going to put the whole show on at the same time. So it was really threatening, I think, initially, and still is.
Fascinating. And then you're like, and now I'll be a VC.
It wasn't quite that transition, but I think if you're in an environment where look, I loved learning about entertainment, but I also realized it was not what drove me. Z, your conversation with Z in the last podcast was super interesting, like this passion and curiosity question. And I think I just kind of came to the conclusion that what I get really passionate about is helping people kind of take their idea and grow it. And I really missed the venture days of like finding people who like just astounded me and would come with these insights that I had never thought of, but needed capital and resources. And I just love the energy of like enabling ideas to actually come to fruition. And I was not getting that, in the role that I was at Netflix. And so, I left there with this idea of like, I want to get onto the capital side. I want to get into the early stage side. Didn't quite know. I actually initially thought I was going to do a debt fund. And so debt is great, but debt is not the right stage for this. So what I really want to do is equity and like early stage VC investing. And it's like coming to that realization is one, and then two, like verbalizing it is another. And so I remember it was like August of last year, and I just had this realization, and I was like, well, like it's a hard industry to break into. How do I go about doing it? And I just remember just having one conversation with a friend and just saying, hey, this is what I'm thinking about doing. And it was like, oh, okay, now I know how to help you. I was like, oh, okay. Totally. And it's like, you don't think of it that way. Like you just think about like, oh, they're going to make fun of me, or I'm going to sound foolish, or, and instead it just enabled people to open doors that they were willing to open for me.
I mean, is it a total aside? I think of mentorship. One of the big roles I think of mentorship is helping people admit what they want to be doing. Yep. Just admit things to themselves, sort of. But that's great. So you sort of started talking about it, and then people could help you. And how did that evolve into Wedbush Ventures Fund 1?
So when I was at Grand Point Bank, Grand Point had acquired, Wedbush had a commercial bank at that time, and Grand Point Bank had acquired that commercial bank, and I'd helped with that. I'd heard that they were interested in an early stage venture fund. They had previously set up a private equity fund and a hedge fund, SBIC fund, and they own line brokerage. And essentially they're looking at what are different asset classes in which they can make investments or sponsor funds. And so, had a great initial conversation with them. And it also happened really, it's amazingly quickly. Like I had anticipated for all of this to take quite a while. And, I put and it's like when you think about something for a long time and then you have an opportunity to present it, and it just kind of, I sat down one night and put here's what my ideal venture fund would look like. I put that on paper, and the next day presented it to the Wedbush team, and they said, "This sounds great. Let's do it."
Wow.
And the rest is history.
Fantastic. And so they are more like an anchor LP. Like you're an independent fund. You just happen to sort of have their name.
Yeah, have their name. They're an anchor LP. They do my back office, and they also provide me their platform, I'll say. And so I've been able to meet the investment banking team and the analysts, and that's been actually really helpful for my portfolio companies, and something that I probably wasn't really thinking about when we were putting this fund together.
Yeah, fantastic. And now, in terms of deals and things that you're interested in, I keep sending you things that seem, I keep enjoying looking at deals together.
So I look for things that I feel like I know, and also, I'm a one-person fund, and so due diligence is a lot easier if you know the industry and you know the space. So I just naturally gravitate to things that I know, and so so regulated industries is one thing I always think about, or I always just having the experience of coming from a kind of a tech background, especially Silicon Valley tech background, and then coming into a bank, and just like, how do you, how do you like think big picture, but still work through, like think big picture, but still work with the regulations and figure out which regulations you can not bend, but like build relationships to change, and which regulations can't change, and there's usually a reason why they can't change, and how do you work within that, and how do you really build partnerships with people who are already in the industry. I think that's the biggest thing I saw in banking in particular, is like some of the early stage fintech companies just said, oh, we're going to disrupt banking, we're going to get rid of banking, and like those usually don't work out. If you need a bank as your back end to build your business, you need to find a bank that will think creatively and not just see big risk factor, but you also need to be able to talk their language and get them bought into why, like, that you've thought through the risks. And because the one thing I learned in banking is that people aren't, they've seen a lot of things go wrong, and so when they ask questions, it's not to be annoying, it's not to be, but it's just like, it's actually very much because I've seen it before, and so to actually really listen to their question and listen to what's behind their questions, I think is important.
Yeah. Interesting. So, okay. So your background at Grand Point didn't scare you away from fintech at all. How about content and your experiences at Yahoo and at Netflix?
Yes. On the one hand, you have it's a lot easier to be a content creator now. And there are all these platforms that make it very easy to be a content creator, and authenticity, like TikTok, I think is amazing. But I also just think about all these new subscription services that are coming about, and there's a school of thought that says, okay, well, if I have this niche audience, but it's a very, if I can just find enough people that will pay me $20 a month, that's a nice business. But I think about what's the model after subscription, or how do we build these subscription models that enable us to really pick and choose what we want? Because I just don't think it's scalable for us to have, we're going to run this whole cable model all over again, where we are spending $200 a month on all these different things, and it's just not sustainable. And we're going to get to a reckoning point where we're not going to be able to, pay the $10 for my powder sports and my yoga and my, so I think a lot about what is the new wave of monetization. And I also think about what's the next platform, because everyone always talks about oh, I have this many followers on Instagram, and so I can monetize those followers. But 9 times out of 10, when you try to take those followers off of Instagram and somewhere else, they don't follow necessarily. They follow you on Instagram because Instagram is fun and they like to see you on Instagram, but it's not like they like you enough to then go to the next platform that you're on. And so I think a lot about that, what is it, again, you need to build it so it works for both sides. And we've thought a lot about the content creators, but we haven't really thought about what's the next thing that we as consumers are looking for.
When you're thinking about the next platform, how are you thinking about what that might look like?
Yeah, I think a lot. So I think podcasting is super interesting.
As do I, Petra.
Podcast right here. And the reason I say that is it's something that well, I mean, one, it's relatively new, but audio itself is something you can consume in so many more situations than you can video content. And for podcast content, like how can you create like the Netflix of podcasts, for example? And then in terms of like, everybody says social is dead, and I don't know what it is, but I think there's something, there's the next TikTok coming, and it's something around video, and just being able to communicate more closely with the person behind the video is my guess.
Right. So it's engagement, or it's interactivity or something.
Yeah. Yep.
And do you think that because it's more authentic, I'm more likely to give money because I feel connected to you?
Yeah. And I think this is something similar to music, right? Music went from not making a ton of money off of the CD itself, but more of the events and concerts and merchandise. And so what's that equivalent? I think the willingness to pay for content will hit a wall soon. And so I think about other ways in which people are finding value in what this person is creating. And I think it's around community. I think it's around being proud of being in a community and being proud of what the community stands for.
Totally. Yeah. And I think it's interesting that community, were you and I talking about this? Like my friend who's been working on erectile dysfunction and hair loss e-commerce. And she was like, it's hard to build community there, right? Yeah. It was you and me.
Private joy and public joy. And I think a lot about this. Like, I think about these like small communities. Like everyone says, oh, you don't need a whole lot of people to monetize the community. And that's true. But I think it depends on the community. And I think there's some communities where like erectile dysfunction, you're not going to have like a t-shirt saying
merchandising for that one stuff.
There are some interesting communities though that are very passionate and also very connected. And I think kind of programming towards those communities is interesting.
I need to hit like Wedbush Ventures a little bit more in terms of, what size check are you writing and how do you like to engage with your portfolio?
Yep. So given that we're pre-seed seed stage, check size is 50 to 100K as a first check-in with the intent of continuing to support the company. I like to get, as I said, I like to get involved with my companies.
Kind of going back to our Netflix stuff. Can you coach people on that sort of softer skills?
Yeah, actually, that's one question I was going to ask you, because it's something I think about all the time. Like in the deck, like if I get a deck and I don't understand what the problem statement is and what the solution is in a deck, it's like, okay, well, is that just an instant no? Or is that something, I don't know. What do you think?
No, but for me, it's okay. It's if they then meet me, if we then talk in person, I try to think like I'm a reasonably smart person. If you can't explain it to me, then it's a turnoff, because communications is so important. It's so vital. And so even if it's a complicated thing, you got to know your audience and start at an entry point that I can understand and communicate from there.
Yeah. But to answer your question, I think communication is a difficult skill to learn and unlearn and relearn, but I also always give everyone the benefit of the doubt. And that's one thing I learned at Netflix. You give people feedback and then see if they can figure out what to do with that feedback.
Yeah, that's nice. Anything else in terms of advice you're giving a lot to founders, or even advice you've been given?
I mean, I think a focus is so cliche, but it's something that I think a lot about also for myself as a one-person fund, and also for founders. Like it's just so easy to get wrapped up in kind of this next shiny object and this opportunity that falls into your lap. And so just really being clear to yourself about what's your success metric. Like that's one thing I learned from a mentor of mine, just like being just very clear about like what is the one or two things, the most two things that you really want to knock it out of the park with, and make sure you knock it out of the park, and then the rest will just kind of go away.
Great. Well, this is a great transition into my miscellaneous personal question section. So Petra, what do you think about your success metrics for yourself in your life?
Ooh, in my life. Wow. I mean, ultimately just being able to look back and be, all right, I'm going to give you two because family is super important to me. Relationships around me are super important to me, and I always prioritize those. But I want to have no regrets, and I want to embrace everything that comes in front of me.
Do you have any good strategies for not having regrets?
My strategy is, and I don't know, it's not always effective, is just thinking about myself in the future, and is this something that I wish I had spent time on or not? And the other thing I always think about is like, is this going to be an emotionally happy? Is this going to give me energy, or is it going to take energy out? And if it takes energy out, then it needs to be quick no. And also always making time for yourself. I think that's the biggest thing. Like for me, it's exercise. I think it also, there's a chemical impact on your body from exercise for me personally. I was a competitive athlete all through school.
Did I know this about you? What did you play in college?
I swam. I was a swimmer.
Oh, I was going to ask you, like, where do you get your confidence from? This was a question I wanted to ask you because I think it's hard and it takes some guts to start your own venture fund. But do you think it relates at all to playing sports your whole life?
I do. I also think it's cliche, but I do. And I also think, I know as a swimmer, you learn to put your head down and just push through. And that's something I learned. I started swimming competitively when I was 9, I think. And so it's just like, it starts to become ingrained in you. And we talked about like work-life balance and like I have twins and an older son, and they're now older and it's a lot easier. But, I remember when they were the age of your kids and everyone's like, oh my God, how do you do it? And it's like, and when you're in it, it's just like, how do you minimize the drama? How do you just take a few deep breaths and just put your head down and move forward?
That's great. I love it. Well, I'm really excited to get to know you better. I'm really excited that we get to co-invest and be part of this ecosystem. And thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. It's fun.